Casey's biggest hits.
3 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was Do You Remember? By a singer who says he could have been the Billy Idol of the 60s, except he was too short and didn't have enough hair. I'll have details on that big hit after this.
American Top 40.
Now at number 7 in the countdown is the latest hit by a rock star who says one of the biggest thrills of his career was playing the conga drums at a recording session for one of the Beatles. But nobody's heard that record. Here's the story. Phil Collins recently told us that back in the late 60s, when he was still in his teens, he was the percussionist for a band called Flaming Youth. One day he was sitting at home in London watching TV when the phone rang. It was one of Beatle George Harrison's assistants wondering if Phil had time to play congas on a solo record George was cutting. Phil told us he couldn't believe his ears. You know he had time. He hopped a cab to the Abbey Road studios and walked in to find some of the biggest names in music. There was Ringo Starr on drums, Billy Preston on organ, Morris Gibb singing backup, Phil Spector producing, and many others. George Harrison introduced himself to Phil Collins and then showed the teenager what he wanted him to play. And Phil says he really threw himself into it, pounding the congas so hard his hands were beaten raw and covered with blisters. He says after a couple of hours of playing, he was thanked by George, paid by check for his services. But that song that Phil played on wasn't included on George Harrison's album, and as far as he knows, never released. But Phil can prove he once played with Beatle George. He never cashed that check. Still has it. At number 7 this week, here's Beatle fan Phil Collins with Marilyn Martin and Separate Lives.
You call me from the room in your hotel.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
Now we're up to the number 1 song in the USA, and it's brought to you by Sears. This week's number 1 comes from a man who's already been there 8 times. 2 times as drummer and vocalist for the band Genesis, and 6 times as a solo artist. Even with all that success, though, Phil Collins says when he meets another big rock star, he often turns into a starstruck fan himself. When it comes to meeting his idols, he's still just a big kid at heart. Phil says, quote, "When you're as starstruck as I am, it's a great opportunity to do what I do. I'll be playing on a record with Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Eric Clapton, and I'll be thinking, what am I doing here? These are really great musicians. I have to fight back the urge to ask them for their autographs." Phil also says he has a lot of trouble thinking of himself as a star. He told us that to him, a star is someone who's bigger than life. A star is someone like Frank Sinatra or Judy Garland. Phil says, me? I'm just a guy who plays the drums and sings. I'm too regular to be a star. I walk into a room, and I'm the last person anyone notices. Maybe what I've got to do is take some star lessons. Well, whether he feels like it or not, Phil Collins is a star. And this week on Casey's Top 40, the soft-spoken man who says he melts just like a kid when he meets his rock idols is the biggest star of them all. For the second week in a row, the number 1 song in the USA is Another Day in Paradise by Phil Collins.
And a couple of weeks ago, Phil Collins told us the story of the day 15 years ago when Peter Gabriel left Genesis and Phil took over as the group's lead singer. Well, Genesis became bigger than ever, and Phil, well, of course, he went on to become a solo superstar, but we wondered and just had to ask him, what if Peter Gabriel had never gone solo? Would he ever have gone solo?
No, I think if Peter Gabriel had not left, my solo career, if there was to be one, would have taken a very different direction. I think it would probably have been much more fusion, jazz orientated than it is now, although there's still elements of that in my music, which a lot of people tend to overlook. But obviously not hits. You know, they're not the kind of things that get played on the radio, so no one ever hears them.
And what does that kind of music sound like? Let's listen. And that's a little piece of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning from Phil Collins' current solo album, But Seriously. Phil says if he'd never become lead singer of Genesis, that's the kind of music he would have kept making outside of the group.
Around the world with a shadow.
Song at 33 this week, his latest hit from Genesis. It's called Jesus, He Knows Me. Now, Phil Collins told us the band was inspired by televangelists, and one of them in particular.
The one that sticks with me the most is a guy called Ernest Ainsley, who is not disreputable. And he is to be seen, to be believed. I mean, I could watch an hour of him and not get bored. I mean, he's great fun. But really, the kind of guys we're talking about are the people that, and they know who they are, you know, and we all know who they are, and modesty prevents me from mentioning their names. But they do. They're either in prison or they're going to prison for not practicing what they preach, basically. And the insincerity of the whole thing and the hypocrisy. And they're there every Sunday, 24 hours a day for that particular day, all across the channels. There's hundreds of them.
You see the face on the TV screen, coming at you every Sunday. Casey's biggest hits.
3 years ago this week, one of the biggest hits in the USA was by a singer who says he could have been the Billy Idol of the 60s, except he was too short and he didn't have enough hair. There are few musicians who are as good at poking fun at themselves as Phil Collins. Recently, he was going through his career with a reporter. He talked about how back in the late 60s, he was part of flamboyant art rock bands with names like Flaming Youth and Brand X. Phil says he'd dress in leather jackets and pants for those bands and spike up his hair. He says he was Billy Idol before there was a Billy Idol. Only problem was, Phil says, he looked silly in black leather. And he never had enough hair to make it really spiky. That's why he decided the best thing to do was just dress like himself.
For Casey Kasem, I'm David Perry. Now we're up to the #1 smash every day. It's by a British superstar who helps to keep the budget for his videos under control by simply wearing his own clothes. Over the years, Phil Collins has carefully developed a reputation as a fellow who's a lot more in his music than his look. While other stars might dress in furs and feathers and leather and spandex, Phil simply and efficiently wears the same clothing both on stage and off. He likes nice baggy corduroy trousers, well-worn jeans that aren't too tight, woolly sweaters, and cozy jackets. When it comes to making his videos, Phil's record company regularly budgets in a few $1,000s for his wardrobe. But Phil always tells them there's no need. He'll just pick a few nice items out of his own closet. In case you're interested, he recently told Porter that his favorite jeans are from a company called Diesel. The nice tweed overcoat he loves comes from a firm called Williwear. But the British superstar doesn't know where the scarf he wears comes from. You see, the label fell off a couple of years ago. All in all, Phil feels comfortable as could be in his own clothing in his videos. He says it allows him to feel like himself and not like somebody pretending to be him. This week, the superstar who just loves his comfortable clothes moves back up 2 notches to number 17 on Casey's Countdown.
Casey's Countdown.
I'm Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to a Casey's Countdown Extra. It's by Phil Collins, a rock and roll superstar who recently launched a big band tour with a sold-out concert that got South African President Nelson Mandela up on his feet and dancing. Phil Collins has always been a big fan of the swing-era music his parents listened to. And recently, for a change of pace, the British pop superstar assembled a 20-piece band for a series of high-profile performances. It was called the Phil Collins Big Band Tour, and it opened on July 11th with an all-star performance at London's Royal Albert Hall. It was a concert to celebrate the friendship between Britain and South Africa. And among the people who were there were Prince Charles and South African President Nelson Mandela. The concert featured the Phil Collins Big Band, led by a very special guest conductor, Quincy Jones. Phil and the band performed new arrangements of his own hits, as well as big band standards. Midway through the show, they were joined by Tony Bennett, who came on stage to perform his renditions of swing-era classics like Glenn Miller's The Lady's in Love with You and Paul Whiteman's Changes. And then there were performances by several prominent South African dancers and musicians. By the end of the night, most of the people in the audience were up on their feet dancing, and leading them all from the royal box was none other than President Mandela himself. Now, here's an example of the kind of music Phil Collins usually makes, a song he took all the way to #1 back in 1985. As a Casey's Countdown Extra, this is Phil Collins and One More Night.
One more night, counting down the hits with Casey Kasem.
12 years ago, Phil Collins was looking for a new song to record. So what did he do? He knocked on the door of a Motown legend and walked away with a #1 pop hit. The year was 1988. Phil was about to get started on a film that he was starring in called Buster, a film in which Phil played a bank robber. Phil was going to record the soundtrack for the film as well, but he just didn't have the time to write the songs for the soundtrack. And so he started thinking about just who his dream list of songwriters might be. High atop the list was the great Motown songwriter Lamont Dozier, who co-wrote and co-produced dozens of hits for the Supremes, the Temptations, and the Four Tops. Phil had met Lamont Dozier sometime before when Phil was performing in L.A., and Lamont dropped backstage to offer some kind words. They'd struck up a friendship. Lamont told Phil if he were ever in town to drop on by. And that's what Phil did one day. The always informal Phil Collins showed up at Lamont's doorstep to ask him to write some songs. He just drove up to his house, knocked on the door, and asked, "Is Lamont in?" The result, a #1 song and an American Top 20 Extra this week. Here's Phil Collins with that smash, Two Hearts. That's Phil Collins with an American Top 20 Extra, his #1 hit from 1989, Two Hearts.
American Top 20.